Obviously, we're here to urge House Republicans to settle their differences among themselves, come to their senses, and honor the deal that they made with President Biden earlier this year. If they fail to uphold this basic responsibility, then they will trigger a completely avoidable shutdown. If that happens, then about 84 hours from now, the U.S. federal government will be forced to close, threatening our economy, our national security, and leaving Americans in every state and territory less safe. I want to make clear that the impact of a potential Republican shutdown so that there is no confusion about what's at stake for transportation, for working families, and for all Americans. And just as importantly, I want to talk about what's at stake for all of us if those who are holding this funding hostage get their way in their demands for severe cuts to important federal functions, including transportation safety. But first, I just want to identify with the millions of Americans who are looking at what's happening in Washington right now in disbelief. Funding the U.S. government is a basic responsibility of Congress. It is not normal that in the most powerful country in the world, fringe congressional Republicans from time to time are able to put the entire country at risk of simply shutting down the government. In particular, I'm concerned about the casual disregard that is being shown for the people who would be impacted the most. Any House Republican comfortable with shutting down the government should explain themselves directly to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines whose paychecks will stop after Saturday. And they should explain themselves directly to all of the nonpartisan civil servants who make sure that planes land safely, who inspect trucks and railroads and pipelines to prevent disasters, who will have to go without pay. I'm also concerned by the context of the cuts that these House Republicans are trying to force. There's a lot of attention going to the possible shutdown. In my view, not enough attention going to the objective of that threatened shutdown, which is to extract cuts that the overwhelming majority of Americans reject. So let's take a minute to review how we got here. This summer, President Biden and Speaker McCarthy shook hands and made a bipartisan deal to keep this country running. And 2/3 of House Republicans voted for that deal. I should note that deal was tough for all sides. Frankly, it was tough for this department because it meant cutting back on funding for good infrastructure projects that we believe in, fixing roads and bridges and airports, but we accepted it because that was the deal. Now, a fringe group of House Republicans is refusing to honor that deal, putting them at odds with the majority of their own party as well as the majority of the American people. They are holding key functions of our government hostage to try to get extreme cuts to things like childcare and Meals on Wheels that so many Americans count on every day. Let me emphasize what a shutdown would mean for transportation. After everything that we have been through, after all of the disruptions to air travel, especially the ones that we saw last year, we have finally seen cancellations and delays get back down to normal levels. In fact, we've seen cancellations go to a level now that is lower than it was before the pandemic. We've done that, pushing airlines to do better. We've expanded passenger rights, and we've accelerated improvements to FAA's own staffing and technology. But a shutdown would stop all of that progress. It would mean we would immediately have to stop training new air traffic controllers and furlough another 1,000 controllers who are already in the training pipeline. And I want to emphasize that the complexity of the hiring and training process means even a shutdown lasting a few days could mean we will not hit our staffing and hiring targets next year. Meanwhile, it would deprive those air traffic controllers who are still working of their paychecks. And I want you to imagine the pressure that a controller is already under every time they take their position at work. And then imagine the added stress of coming to that job from a household with a family that can no longer count on that paycheck. That is the consequence of a shutdown. But also, whether there's a shutdown or not, I want to go through some of the things that would happen if House Republicans get their way on cuts. To absorb the 8% cut that they have proposed, we would have to totally freeze FAA hiring in operations and facilities. We would be set back in modernizing systems like the NOTAM system that led to nationwide havoc with just a 90-minute outage earlier this year. And what's especially galling is that we see some of the same elected officials who have responded even to weather delays by blaming the administration, now turning around and demanding that we cut resources for air traffic control. So that's air travel operations. Then you have rulemaking and grants. So we have been advancing some of the strongest customer protections for airline passengers in generations. Our Office of Aviation Consumer Protection has helped passengers get billions of dollars in refunds for canceled flights. We're developing a rule to get passengers compensated for long delays. We're developing rules to make family seating free so that you never have to pay to sit next to your kid. We're enforcing passenger rights. And a shutdown would stop that work in its tracks. Not to mention work around the department like helping emergency first responders dealing with hazardous materials and work that goes on to strengthen rail safety regulations. Then there's the day-to-day work of rail safety. After the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine earlier this year, leaders on both sides of the aisle in Congress rightly came together to start a process to help make our railroads safer. We are still looking for Congress to follow through and actually pass the Railway Safety Act, but we're not waiting for Congress to do our own continued work on safety under current authorities. But again, a Republican shutdown would stop our work on new safety rules, all because some of the same people who rushed to get in front of a camera during the East Palestine derailment aftermath are now demanding extreme cuts to railroad safety inspections. Their proposal would cut 4,000 safety inspections next year alone, meaning 11,000 miles of railroad track would not get inspected compared to the current levels. So I don't understand how anybody could claim to be serious about railroad safety and then turn around and defund our inspectors. And that's just transportation. A Republican shutdown would affect everything from national security and law enforcement to food safety and disaster relief. And again, those House Republicans who created this hostage situation have made clear that their goal is to force extreme, permanent cuts to a lot of those same programs, the kinds of programs that millions of working families count on every day. That includes nutrition assistance. There are 7 million women and children nationwide who rely on federal nutrition assistance, including half of the babies born in this country. Under a Republican government shutdown, women and children would be potentially turned away at the grocery store. And to be clear, the reason some House Republicans are threatening to shut down the government in the first place is because they want to make permanent cuts to that program and others like it. The president, by contrast, is fighting to expand it so that every eligible mother, expecting mother, and child can get the food that they need. When it comes to our service members, there are 1.3 million active duty troops who would be forced to work without pay until the government is back up and running. And hundreds of thousands of their civilian colleagues at the Department of Defense would be furloughed. Reservists scheduled to drill would be sent home. Their drill time and pay is unrecoverable, something that I remember experiencing as a reservist during a previous shutdown. All of this undermines our national security in very real ways, and it's ironic, to say the least, that some House members who claim to support our military are actively threatening to make our service members work without pay. And then under the cuts that have been proposed, some of the numbers are that 60,000 seniors would lose access to nutrition services like Meals on Wheels. 65,000 children could lose access to childcare. We'd have 40,000 fewer educators affecting 26 million students. 20,000 veterans would lose their housing vouchers and risk homelessness. And 300 more pounds of fentanyl, 6,000 more pounds of methamphetamines, and 50,000 more pounds of cocaine could be let into this country. And their proposal leaves out vital funding that the president has requested for things like rebuilding American communities hit by climate disasters, fighting fentanyl trafficking, and helping Ukrainians defend themselves against Russian invasion. My point is, there is no good time for a government shutdown, but this is a particularly bad time for a government shutdown, especially when it comes to transportation. The consequences would be disruptive and dangerous, and so would the long-term consequences of paying the ransom to avoid it in the form of savage cuts to safety, infrastructure, and other priorities. President Biden keeps his word, and that includes the promises he's made to the American people and the deal that he struck with Speaker McCarthy. Now it is up to those in the House of Representatives to live up to their word. to not play political games with people's lives, to keep the government up and running, and to deliver for the people that they serve. Thanks again for coming, and happy to take a few questions.
Audrey LaForce with Automotive News. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more directly to how a government shutdown might affect the auto industry, specifically, rulemakings that are ongoing at NHTSA, investigations, but also, implementation of the EV charging infrastructure and EV tax credits.
Yeah, this is a dynamic industry that really relies on certainty, especially in the context of some of the rulemakings and the work that's going on. Now, it's really complex and nuanced across the different parts of the grant work, what's affected. The good news is a lot of what we're doing on EV chargers and in other areas was advance appropriated, meaning that work can continue, although even that work could get gummed up by other administrative functions that are not working the way they should in the context of a shutdown. But rulemaking is a good example, and we can get you more specifics across different parts of the agency. But a lot of our rulemaking activity would be stopped, and those relevant people would be furloughed. Again, at a time when the auto sector really needs that certainty to keep up with all of the changes that are going on.
Mark Walker from the New York Times. How do you assure the flying public that they will be safe if they continue to assure the flying public that they will be safe if they continue to travel during a government shutdown, given sort of all the furloughs and the additional pressure that will be on the air travel system?
Well, our air traffic controllers and safety personnel are going to keep going in and doing their job to the extent that they're allowed to in the context of a shutdown. But they're doing it under added stress that is uncalled for, avoidable, and preventable. Look, they're pros, and they do what's required of them, just like our service members in uniform do. But it certainly doesn't help with that safety-critical job for them to come to work with the stress of not getting paid. And I would add that each passing day, it gets more difficult and more complicated as different parts of the agency that aren't coming in, as that catches up to the rest of the system. And I think that's something we saw historically the last time there was a shutdown, where over time it began to take more and more of a toll on air traffic controllers, on TSA officers, who also, of course, aren't getting paid. And, of course, we count on them every day to keep the system safe. Go ahead.
Hi, Aaliyah Walls with Fox News Channel. Do you think that President Biden should sit down with Speaker McCarthy in the next 3 days to try and negotiate this out and prevent a shutdown? And what would that conversation look like?
Well, we don't have to speculate. Yes, it's absolutely appropriate for the President and the Speaker to sit down and negotiate a deal. And they did earlier this year. All we're asking is that the Speaker stick to the deal that they already worked out.
Following up on Mark's question, can you elaborate what it means for the average American when you say that 1,000 air traffic controllers would be furloughed or the training program would be cut? What does that mean for the average person right now and in the months and years to come?
So I think the context is this. We have obviously seen a lot of disruptions to air traffic, especially last year. Now, some of those are caused by weather. Some of those were caused by airline issues. But a factor can be the availability of air traffic control staffing. We've seen a gap that has opened up over many years between the level of staffing we need and the level of staffing we've got. We finally have that headed in the right direction. Hired 1,500 controllers this year. Our budget calls for 1,800 controllers to be hired next year. But that can't happen if we get stopped in our tracks with training. So at the end of the day, that means more shortages and more outages, and that can contribute to cancellations and delays. Same thing with the IT side, especially if these cuts go through. We need to go faster, not slower, on things like updating the NOTAM system and many other FAA technologies that have needed upgrades for a long time. You slow that down, you're increasing the chance that there's going to be some issue that leads to disruptions like cancellations and delays for passengers just going about their travel.
Greg Wallace from CNN. The FAA also is going potentially without a reauthorization. How would that compound the impacts of a shutdown, and what would be some of the specific impacts we would see there?
That's right. There's really three things we're concerned about. There are the consequences of a shutdown, there are consequences of the cuts that some House Republicans are demanding as their price of avoiding a shutdown. And then there are the consequences of a lapse in FAA reauthorization. That would have a number of negative impacts. Again, a lot of people wouldn't be able to effectively do their jobs. We would actually not be able to collect revenue or I believe spend revenue from the trust fund, and some of that might never come back in. So effectively, it's kind of like a tax holiday for airline charges that never come in to improve airports and meet other critical needs. So it's right alongside the other forms of disruption, something that we just don't need right now, and we're urging that there be a reauthorization, or at the very least an extension, to keep things operating normally.
Is it back on?
Yeah. Sure.
Uncheck Facebook and everything. Facebook and Twitter haven't been.
Thanks for doing this. In 2019, when the last significant government shutdown occurred, the FAA had to lay off thousands of aviation safety inspectors and engineers, and in fact, about 2 weeks in, recalled about 1,700 safety officials. Are you in a different posture? Like, do you still have to, furlough safety officials, and sort of what discretion, if anything, do you have at this point to handle a potentially lengthy shutdown?
Yeah, teams are working through the finer points of that right now, while we continue to hope and expect that House Republicans will come to terms with each other and then with everybody else to keep government open. We're obviously preparing for any eventuality. Part of the upheaval is you do get these scenarios where people are furloughed at first and then they're recalled, which just contributes to the upheaval that they have to go through. I've already been in sessions where we've started to see the breakdowns of how that works, but some of it also depends on the situations as they unfold. So I cannot say compared to last time that we've become immune to that possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, on the reauthorization deadline, I wanted to ask, you mentioned it could be effectively a tax holiday for airlines. Passengers are obviously paying taxes when they buy an airline ticket. What would happen with that money? Could the airlines, in theory, pocket it, or would there be any way for DOT or Congress to potentially claw that money back if we do get into a situation over the weekend where the reauthorization lapses?
Anecdotally, I've heard of scenarios where airlines have found a way to just adjust their fares accordingly, take the difference. I suppose it depends airline by airline, but the point is some of that might be unrecoverable, absent some other act of Congress. And this jams up the ability to, again, make investments that we need to do every day. Yesterday, I was on runway 17 left, 35 right in Denver, where we're funding improvements both in terms of a taxiway that will help avoid incursions into an approach zone, and lighting that's going to be safer. These are bread and butter things that we need to get done, and you add to that the need to continue progress on the systems modernization. I mean, again, what the NOTAM outage of January this year showed us was that even an hour-and-a-half ground stop is havoc all day for the system. It becomes harder and harder to prevent that if you have a lapse in authorization, not to mention the cuts that have been talked about.
Have you been in touch with any sense of on the Hill about the authorization specifically, whether that might be decoupled from the shutdown, situation where we get a shutdown but we don't get a lapse, for example?
There are definitely a lot of different scenarios that we're talking about with folks on the Hill, including some that would allow some kind of extension. And I believe the approach that was discussed last night is one that has a different timeline for the extension than it does for the CR. We're trying to be ready and nimble to adapt to whatever Congress throws our way, but this is no way to run a ball club. We shouldn't be in this situation to begin with, and if we are, you really want to have weeks into months to be able to game out some of the details. Obviously, our professionals will do whatever it takes, but getting this close down to the wire is a real challenge for us.
So in the last shutdown, you saw absenteeism at the TSA and the FAA kind of creep up the longer it went. Is that understandable at a point, or is your expectation that people are just going to have to bear the pain and keep coming to work as expected?
Well, again, our people are pros. They come in, they do what's required of them. But they're also human beings. And the pressure that they're under grows and mounts each passing day that you're in this scenario. And so the only thing that is even more certain than the harms of a shutdown is that those harms will compound each passing day that you go into that.
Thank you. So what, if anything, is the Biden administration doing to prepare and minimize delays and cancellations at airports in the case of a shutdown?
So let me break it into the things that we've had underway and then the things that we're trying to make sure happen. Part of it is that I think has really contributed to what you see here, which is the cancellation rates below their pre-pandemic levels this year, is that we have pressed airlines to run realistic schedules. That expectation continues. But the enforcement of that or anything else that we can hold airlines accountable to does get interrupted if the Office of Aviation Consumer Protection personnel are not able to even come into work. And that is what we're looking at in a shutdown scenario. There's not much we can do on rulemaking, at least in that side of the House, in the context of a shutdown. Again, the controllers still come in, the TSA personnel still come in, but they'll be under more and more strain each day that this goes on. Even the accepted personnel, in other words, those who are working on things, that they're going to keep coming in FAA, whether it's controllers or other parts of the operation. They're part of a bigger ecosystem here, right? They're part of a bigger FAA, a part of a bigger US DOT, and part of a bigger federal government. That the more you have pieces of it that aren't running, the more that's going to cause some kind of hiccups in their ability to smoothly and efficiently do their job. So we're preparing best we can based on the tools we have, even as we hope and expect that a shutdown will be avoided. But I just cannot guarantee that this progress will continue if a shutdown like that takes place. And then again, there's the training thing. I really want to emphasize that even a few days or weeks could set us back well into next year in terms of what that does, because of what it takes to train and qualify as an air traffic controller. It's not like you get qualified one day, you're good to go, you can go work anywhere. You have to train for the job, and you have to train for the geography you're going to be working. And not just experience, but recent experience matters. We finally are in a place where we have absorbed most of the ripple effects from the hole that COVID blew in our training pipeline, only to have a politically driven one potentially come along. And the deep irony of this is that some of the same people who rushed to try to make a partisan issue out of airline delays last year are behind the disruption or potential disruption this year. Yeah.
I saw that there would be furloughs to the Federal Railroad Administration. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how that would impact their operations if there were a shutdown.
Yeah, again, the rulemaking activity might be unglamorous, but what we're talking about is advancing very important rules. The effort to ensure that trains have 2 or more crew members, which takes a lot of work because of the complexity of the regulatory process. That would be interfered with at a time when I think everybody gets that 2, 3, 4 mile long trains. We ought to have at least, we need to have adequate staffing on them. We can get you more details on the FRA impacts, but some of the other functions that I think are very important would be interrupted. And then you get to the cuts. Remember, the whole premise of the shutdown is try to force cuts that go deeper than what the president and the speaker agreed to. 11,000 fewer miles of track being inspected is what we estimate would be the effect. And that's of the 8% CR. Let alone the one they voted, the CR with the 8% cuts, let alone the one they actually voted for in April that had more severe cuts. So there's no way you can say you're about more railroad safety and then cut access or cut inspections that are helping to make sure that that safety is secured. All right. We'll be in touch if you need any kind of more detailed numbers from the department, but thanks again for coming in. Appreciate it.